Thanks for joining us. I'm Diane Rehm. Actor Alan Alda has interviewed hundreds of scientists, has hosted the PBS series Scientific American Frontiers. He says he uses his training as an actor to help scientists learn improvisation techniques to better engage their students and the public. Alan Alda joins me in the studio. You can watch live video of our conversation with Alan Alda at drshow.org. You can join us by phone at 800-433-8850. You can send an email to drshow@wamu.org. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Alan Alda, how good to see you again.
How good to see you too, except you got me scared when you said we're on video. Now I can't slouch. I usually slouch on the radio.
Well, I have to ask you about that photograph that many of us saw in one of those supermarket tabloids saying Alan Alda is dying. I'm so glad to see you looking so well.
Thank you. It's interesting. Those tabloids really regard us not as people, but as cartoon characters, and they can just manipulate what, it's so funny. They said his friends, meaning me, his friends are urging him to tell his secrets. And then they list the secrets, which are taken from one of my books. So it's not much of a secret.
But to put on the headline, Alan Alda.
Sad last days. I know.
Sad last days.
Well, it's really a joke. I mean, I think that's the same newspaper, so-called newspaper, that had a headline once, "None gives birth to two-headed alien."
So there you are, and your poor wife was
she was
upset.
a little upset, but as soon as she heard me laughing about it, she got over it.
Good. Well, I want you to know that every time my son comes to visit me, he's 54.
Yeah.
Every time he comes to visit me, the first thing he does is go into the library, turn on the television, and watch reruns of MASH. It's still
he doesn't talk to you that much.
He loves the program. He's memorized just about every
people
word.
say to me, I know every line of that show, and I say that's better than I could do when I shot it. Because I never knew my lines.
You probably made up half the lines.
I wrote about 10% of MASH, but even when I wrote it, I couldn't remember. The trouble is when you write it, you have rewritten it so many times.
True.
Then when you try to say it, there are about 10 different versions in your mouth ready to come out.
Well, whatever you wrote, it all came out beautifully.
Well,
it really is quite a program. But now you've come to Washington to give a lecture and a workshop at the National Academy of Sciences. Tell us why.
We're very excited about this because these are such top institutions, the National Academy of Science and the National Science Foundation. And this has all been made possible by the Kavli Foundation, which has been very generous to us. The center that I helped start, which is based at Stony Brook University in New York, is now called the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. And we've come to Washington, to the National Academy of Sciences, to do a 2-day workshop. And this is so exciting because this is a workshop in helping scientists communicate about their work in a way that those of us in the public can understand it, because it's clear and vivid and related to our lives, and not in the technical jargon that the work is done and usually communicated among scientists, but made available to all of us. But what's wonderful about this workshop, is really exciting to me, is that these are the leaders of these organizations taking the workshop in the same way that we usually work with graduate students and PhD students. But now the leaders of science in the country have begun taking the classes.
Tell me what they need to learn.
I think the most fundamental thing about communicating is reading the mind of the person you're talking to, because you need to know where they are when you start talking with them. You need to know it's the old saying, know your audience. But
of course.
what we do is we give the people we're working with a chance to go through exercises and games based on improvisation exercises that give them a chance to get so familiar with the other people that they're working with. They read the signals, they read the clues coming off the face and the voice of the other person, so they know where their mind is at every moment. And when they communicate with them in a lecture hall, they have an intimate relationship with them. They're not talking to a vast, unfaced crowd.
So I'm sure that you have favorites within the scientific community that you believe communicate very well.
Well, there are people that the country has recognized, like Brian Greene, Neil deGrasse Tyson is loved. There are many, something we found, though, is that we've worked with senior scientists all across the country who are now communicating with the public, and often very, very well. And even they improve when they take these classes.
Tell me how improvisation figures into it.
Well, the thing is, it's very important to distinguish what we do from what most people think of as improvisation, because most of us are exposed to improvisation as a form of comedy. Second City or Saturday Night Live or the television show Whose Line Is It Anyway? The whole point there is to get a laugh every 15 seconds.
Sure.
And then there are a lot of gags. We don't do anything like that. This is based on the work of a woman called Viola Spolin, whose son actually founded Second City. But her work was very pure. It was about 70 years ago she started doing this improvisation for the theater, it's called, or improvising games. And what these games do is put you in contact with the other player, in such contact that you actually can almost read their minds. In fact, some of the early exercises, like a mirroring exercise, where I become your mirror, and whatever you do, I'm doing it at the same moment you're doing it. So I really have to incorporate signals from you that usually go past us, where they go unrecognized in normal consciousness. But I get so tuned into you that I can do it no matter what you're doing, and then you do no matter what I'm doing, and then there's no leader at all.
Huh.
And that a lot of people thought that wasn't possible. And I've just talked a couple of days ago to a scientist who did research on it, and within milliseconds they're doing the same thing. They're both leading.
Huh.
So when you get that tuned into another person, then you're in a position to know if they understand what you're saying to them. You can just see it on their face.
Certainly, part of the problem that I have noticed with some scientists, and not just scientists.
No, it's true of everybody.
Who've come onto the program is that they use words that may be familiar to them,
Yeah.
but don't recognize that they may not be familiar to their audience.
This is captured by a term that is known as the curse of knowledge. It was invented by a couple of economists a couple of decades ago. And the curse of knowledge, and it's a strange term because knowledge shouldn't be a curse. It's a wonderful thing to have. But the curse of knowledge is when you don't remember what it's like not to know something at the depth you know it, or in the terms you know it. Sometimes it's just too complex. You understand all the moving parts. The person you're talking to doesn't. But you assume they do because you know it. So if you know it, surely they do. And sometimes it's an ordinary word. It's a word used to mean something else. There was a meeting of scientists in Washington a couple of years ago, a group of nanoscientists and a group of neuroscientists, and they were going to collaborate to understand the brain better. They couldn't agree on what the word probe meant. Probe meant something different to each group.
Huh.
And they had arguments about it. You can't use a probe now in this situation, because they meant something different. So you never really, you can't assume that they know what you know. And it's no dishonor to explain it in simple terms. You know, the one of the most amazing examples of communication I had when I was in Chile and I had to have part of my intestines removed in an emergency operation. And the doctor said it to me in such clear terms that there was no doubt in my mind that he had to do it. He said, some of your intestine has gone bad, and we have to cut out the bad part and sew the two good ends together. Now, he could have said that in,
made it very complicated.
he could have said it in words that were Latinate and that I would never get. But and by the way, that's not only clear, it's absolutely accurate.
Alan Alda. He is a 7-time Emmy Award-winning actor, my favorite on the series MASH. He's here in Washington giving a lecture to the National Academy of Science and the National Science Foundation. We'll be back after a short break. With me, and I know many of you will want to join our conversation. Alan Alda, before the break, you were talking about that experience in Chile where the doctor explained to you in very direct terms that he would have to operate because he was going to have to remove part of your intestine. You almost died. You said to me after we went off the air that you have found yourself really changed as a result of nearly dying.
That's true.
How have
Well,
you
it was,
changed?
although it was 12 years ago, I still am really aware that I could be dead now. And instead of that, I'm alive. And things that I've accomplished, things I've worked on and enjoyed, including time with my family, with my wife, are things I know are a bonus. And I really am, I think I feel impelled to make the most of the time I have left, with this second chance I have. It's a wonderful thing, oddly enough, to almost die and not die, because you have a chance to appreciate what you have in a way that you never could before. I was always glad to be alive, but not this much.
You think we all take life sort of for granted?
Well, we do. It's amazing that we're all going to die, and we act as if it's, I have a friend who said this wonderful thing. She said, we know we're going to die, but not in our lifetime. You know?
So we
I mean,
just
we believe it's not going to happen. We're
absolutely.
totally immune to the thought of this ultimate reality that every single one of us will go through. So this does wake you up to that. And I mean, this Center for Communicating Science was a dream of mine maybe 15 years ago. But the idea that it's now flourishing like this wouldn't have happened if that doctor hadn't saved me in Chile.
Now, but on the other hand, you have had an interest in science, in biology, chemistry, since you were quite young. So, though you went the acting route, have you maintained that interest all
Oh, I
along?
do. I actually don't read. I pretty much don't read anything but about science. I
Really?
read several science journals every issue. I read books about it. I joined a fiction book club, a book club that only reads novels, to force myself to read novels because I don't read them ordinarily. And there's a lot of serious, good writing going on. But the only trouble is, what I have against novels is you can just tell they're making it up. You know, I want reality. I thrive on reality, but it's another kind of reality. It's reality once removed. When it's really well written, the funny thing is, when it's really well written, you know it's not made up, even though it's the product of imagination. You know it represents
Interesting.
some deep
Yeah.
reality.
How about your parents? Were they encouraging of your scientific interests?
Well, I never studied science formally. I wish I had. I was an amateur inventor, and as a little boy, I did what I thought were experiments, and they were tolerant of that.
Such as?
Well, I would used to mix my mother's face powder and toothpaste to see if I could get it to blow up. I couldn't make an explosion happen. It was very discouraging. I had the wrong ingredients. You know, there are things in the household I now know that will blow up if you
That's
put them together.
right.
Fortunately, I was too young to reach them on the shelf.
But you continued your interest, and
Yeah.
even as you continued with your acting career.
Right. But I'm suited. My life has worked out perfectly. What I learned as an actor, especially what I learned studying improvisation and then teaching improvisation, it turns out is vital to communication. So I can bring together my interest in science and my love of science and my love of what scientists do. I'm awed by them. And I can bring together with that interest what I've learned as an actor, not to turn scientists into actors, not to turn them into comedians, but to help them bring the true self in them out so that the public can connect to a real human being and not a walking set of facts.
We do have a dearth of understanding about science as ordinary citizens, in part, I think, because many of us may be put off by the language or the failure on the part of those trying to teach us science.
Right.
That they can't get through to us.
I agree with you. And it's not just that they don't have enough facts to understand the science. Sometimes there isn't the same appreciation for evidence or an understanding of the way science moves forward, because there's sometimes impatience on the part of the public that last year you told me red wine was good for me. Now you tell me it might not be so good. You know, can't they make up their minds?
Yeah,
You know, that
right.
That's
or aspirin, or
Right.
the things we were just talking about.
Right. There's a long list of these things, and the thing that one of the things that the public will get used to, I think, once they hear scientists communicating in a plain way with them, in a vivid way, is that science with current research, whatever the research is, isn't looking for the truth. It's looking for as much of the truth as they can get now. And they're going to find out more tomorrow. And that'll open up a whole bunch of other doors, each one marked with a big question mark. every time you discover something, you realize there's a lot you don't know and you have to look for more. And sometimes it seems to contradict what you said before, but it's not like they're coming up with the final answer to everything. It's an adventure. That's what I find exciting about it. That's why I keep reading it, because I love to read, oh, we thought this 10 years ago, and now we see more deeply into it, and it's only this under certain circumstances. Now we see how it's affected by other circumstances and that kind of thing. Look at what we're going through with Pluto, how it's captured everybody's imagination.
Yes.
And partly because they changed their mind about whether or not it was a planet.
I'm not sure they really have changed their mind.
Have you had people on both sides of it?
Well, that's the point that I keep hearing people saying, well, I'm not so sure yet. But the other issue is that science, exactly as you say, is an ongoing process, so that those involved in it I'll put it another way, are reluctant to say where we are, because tomorrow it may be different.
I think there's sometimes in order to make it clear that they've discovered something that seems to be a big breakthrough, they don't want to exaggerate it too much. They don't want to say this is the way it is now for all time, because it always raises more questions. But I find that tantalizing. It's like listening to rumors in a way. You want, well, where did you hear that?
Yeah.
How is that really true? How do you know? It's exciting nothing's more interesting than gossip. But when we get together and gossip about nature and try to pin nature down and figure out what's really going on, it excites some of the same interest in us.
I want to ask you about a little bit of gossip I heard, and that is that you had kind of a disappointing experience when you were 11 years old with a science teacher. Tell us. It wasn't
even a science teacher. It was my regular teacher. I can't remember who she was, and she was doing the best she could. But I was fascinated when I was 11 with the flame at the end of a candle.
Right.
And I couldn't figure out what it was. It was hot. You could put your finger through it. Didn't have any substance. What's going on in there? I wondered. So I asked my teacher, what is that? What's a flame? And she said, oxidation. That was it. That's the whole answer I got. It's like calling it by another name.
Yeah.
That's Fred.
Yeah. Right.
So that I never really found out and what was going on in there. But when I was writing an article for the magazine Science about the importance of communication, I thought, I'm not following my own advice here. I should start off with something personal so that the reader can relate to me, to what what I'm trying to say here. And I remembered this story. And I told the story, and by the end of the article, I said, how about if we turn this into a contest? And how about if all the scientists reading this try to explain what a flame is so that an 11-year-old can understand it? And the winner of the contest will be judged by real 11-year-olds. That's the best
wonderful
part. I did it to give the scientists a chance to see how hard it is to say something complicated in an available way. It turned out to be a wonderful learning experience for the kids, because they were now in charge of the learning process. They had to understand enough about what a flame was so they could judge how good the submissions were. And the submissions were coming in, attacking the problem from different angles. So they were getting a three-dimensional view of what a flame is.
How many submissions did you get?
We got about 800 submissions the first year.
Wow.
And thousands of kids. Now, I think maybe 100,000 kids have taken part in this, because we're now into the fourth year. Every year we change the question.
I see.
The first year it came from a real 11-year-old, which was me. And ever since then it comes from current 11-year-olds. So they've asked, what is time? This last year was, what is sleep? And it was wonderful. I learned so much about sleep.
Fascinating.
Sometimes I learned it listening to the kids while they judged the entries.
Well, tell me what the best explanation was of what
You know
this
what? If you
is.
go to flamechallenge.org,
Flamechallenge.org.
you'll see the winning entries. Some are written and some are video. And they're so good. They're so interesting. And you can, if you don't get it through flamechallenge.org, you could go to Center for Communicating Science.org.
Okay.
Or aldacenter.org.
Okay.
There's all kinds of ways to get to it.
We'll put some of these onto our website.
Oh, great.
And make sure that people look at them. But what a fascinating way to bring kids into it.
You know, it's all based on what I think we found as the fundamental element of communication, which is connection with the audience. And it's oddly enough, I think this is surprising. When we teach, we start out by teaching improv. Then we talk about distilling your message. And then we get into various kinds of writing. The funny thing is, even when you're writing and trying to make something clear to the reader, you're making use of what you learned in the improvisation classes. And so it's not only improvisation to help you be present for a live audience that you're talking to, it even works when you're writing, because I'll tell you in a minute.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Give me an example.
Okay, an example is very basic. If I'm writing something for you, and I don't know you because you're an anonymous reader, but I have a reader in mind, maybe somebody I know and love, somebody whose awareness of what I'm writing about, I can pin down, because I know you. So when I write sentence number 1, I'm preparing your mind for sentence number 2. And at some point in the process, maybe in the rewrite process, maybe not when I'm getting it down in a first draft, but in the rewrite process, I take the place of you. I become you. I play the part of you. And in playing your part, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I'm not ready to hear this. I need something that's a transition to this. This doesn't make sense. Whoever wrote this is suffering from the curse of knowledge. And you can actually use these principles born of improvisation because it has to do with, in essence, reading the mind of the person you're with.
Just a fascinating approach, it seems to me, and one that could help not only scientists, but politicians.
Oh, there is hardly a field. Every time we go out and we've done workshops all over the country. We've gone, this past year, we did 67 workshops at universities and medical schools. A lot of medical schools are getting our help. And every time we go someplace, somebody says, you've got to teach economists this, or somebody says, you don't know what it's like to talk to a philosopher. And I was playing tennis one day, and a guy came up to me. He said, keep doing what you're doing. I'm a physicist, but my wife teaches art history, and I can't understand what she's saying.
Isn't
art
that
history?
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Everybody has their own jargon. My show business has its jargon. I told the folks last night at the talk I gave, I said, we have jargon too. If you were on a movie set and I said to you, go to the Century and bring back the Century, but not the one with the gobo on it, bring back the one with the kook on it, and while you're at it, bring me a half apple. You wouldn't know what I was talking. Those are all real terms for real things.
What do they mean?
Oh, now you want to know.
Yeah.
A century is a century stand on which sometimes you put lights or things that block light. A gobo blocks the light. Makes a shade.
Okay.
And a kook comes from the director George Koukalaris, who used to have patterns, a piece of cardboard cut in a pattern, so when you shine a light through it, it makes a pattern on the wall, like leaves, as though it's coming light through the window. And I think that's where the word kooky came from, because it gave you an odd pattern. And a half apple is based on the idea that there are things called apple boxes on the set, things sturdy. They're the shape of an apple
sure.
box, but it's sturdy. You can stand on it or you can put equipment on it, and a half apple is half the size. But look, these are all simple things, but we have special terms for them for two reasons. One, we know what they mean, and it's a quick way to say it. But the other reason is it makes us feel like hot stuff to talk in a way nobody else can. And that's how the basis of a lot of jargon. And we have to remember that the other people need to hear it so they can get it.
Sort of the way I talk about promos and intros and outros.
And outros, yeah.
And we'll take a short break here. When we come back, time for you to have a chance to put forward your questions, comments for Alan Alda. Stay with us. Welcome back. You know Alan Alda first and foremost as an actor, but he is also a science educator, helping those who are in the scientific profession learn to communicate more clearly, to understand their audience better. And here is an email from Jana in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was in the audience last night at the National Academy. You asked the audience to think about what science concept we wished the public better understood, but we never heard what issue you think needs better public understanding.
I think what we were talking about a minute ago is a long-range, deep problem, deep question, which is I would love to see the public think like scientists more, to be more tuned into the importance of evidence, to question where they get their information, to question their own biases. Do I believe that because there's evidence for it, or would I like it to be true? And I think we'd all benefit from thinking more like scientists. The more we hear from scientists about how they do their work, and the more caught up we are in the adventure of it, the more accustomed we'll be to it. That's been my own history. I the more I read about science as a young man, the more critical I became of my own thinking and what people would tell me. Say, "Oh, got to watch out for that." And I said, "Well, now I say, oh, really? Tell me more about that. Where'd you hear that?"
And what about the question of women in science
Yeah, very
and the
serious
issue
question.
of whether women are turned off by science?
I don't think women are turned off by it so much as turned away by it. Joe Handelsman, who one of the people now who advises the president, did a study where she sent around resumes to science departments around the country. The resumes were identical, except some had the name of a woman at the top and some had the name of a man, easily identifiable as a man or a woman. The ones that were apparently coming from women were not regarded as serious scientists as the ones from men. They were, if they were thought to be hireable, they were offered less money. There was a total reduction in interest in them and it was the same resume. But when they were women, that counted against them.
So how do you account for that? Is it that more men have been in science longer, and therefore they're the ones who are looking at the resumes?
Yeah, and also they haven't gotten the message yet. I mean, they haven't internalized it. Probably there isn't anybody alive in our country who doesn't know that you're not supposed to call a woman a girl, but there are still people
who do.
Not only that, who I know of somebody, this is astonishing to me. When she started to work in his lab, he said, I'll make the same deal with you I make with all my women assistants. If you can stay here 2 years without getting pregnant, I'll give you a case of beer. And gave her a case of beer in front of a crowd of people and said, why? It's humiliating. And this was a scientist, a person presumably unbiased in his thinking. But we all have some biases, and we need to catch up. That's all. It's a question of education.
Here is just a great question from Dan in Sacramento, California. Okay. He says, considering your dedication to science, if the opportunity presented itself to you, would you volunteer for the Mars One mission, even though it means a one-way trip?
In a heartbeat, I would turn that down. You can't say no faster than I can. Are you kidding?
Look, somebody is going to do it.
I wouldn't be Robinson Crusoe either. I wouldn't be the two guys who went across the country with the canoe.
Livingston and
Clark and what's his name?
Yeah, Livingston and
I don't know. We're lost in our memories.
We're pretty bad here. All right, let's go to Lisa in Asheville, North Carolina. You're on the air.
Mr. Alda, I'm so excited to talk to you, and I've studied your work, and one of my favorite articles was Give It to Me Straight, and I love this quote. You said, if scientists can't communicate clearly, the rest of us lose out on the beauty of science, the intrigue, the great detective story it is, and the poetry of it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you like that, because that when people say to me, why should we communicate science? There's so many clear, obvious reasons why. That because it helps economy, because it makes us stronger and more secure. But the thing that I think is the most important is that science is so amazingly beautiful. It's like saying, why do we need poetry or why do we need music? That question's never raised. Why do we need music? It's obvious. It enriches us. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Please go.
No. I've been talking for the hour. Go ahead.
For those of us that can't attend Stony Brook University or the organizations that sponsor your talks, do you have programs to develop more trainers for your program so we can reach more people?
Well, the Kavli Foundation has funded the Alda Kavli Learning Center online, and that we're going to be going online in a few months. It's still being built, and that should have a lot of information where people can train other people. But we have 9 affiliated universities and medical schools around the country, and my dream is to have hundreds of them so that there'll be some place near you where you can go and get this training, because it's so important. Thank you.
And by the way, it was Lewis and Clark.
Lewis and Clark. That's
Lewis and Clark.
Yes.
Let's see. And to Lisa here in Washington, D.C. You're on the air.
Good morning, Diane. I love your show. I'm a regular listener.
Thank you.
And good morning, Mr. Alda.
Good morning.
This is such music to my ears. I applaud you and what you're doing in this area. I am a registered dietitian and a lifelong science communicator. And I'm calling representing a foundation called the International Food Information Council Foundation. And our sole purpose is to communicate science on health, nutrition, and food safety for the public good. And having said all that, I know this center is just brilliant. I agree with you. I wish you had hundreds more around the country. We need more of it. But have you thought about, or are you actively working in the space of nutrition science?
You know, we train people in every conceivable field of science, and it's not to regulate their content or tell them how to present their content or write up their content, but to improve their ability to take their content into their own hands and make it communicable to the public. So I would say, you know, we do, in addition to doing workshops in universities around the country, we also do a summer institute where people come from all over the country for training, and sometimes they go back to their institutions and start centers there. We also do a boot camp in the summer where people come for their own improvement in communication. So your people might be interested in one of those programs.
All right. Good luck to you, Lisa, and to Joe in St. Louis, Missouri, on the air. Let's see if we've got that. Hold
Thank you.
One
Thank you.
second.
There's somebody. Hello.
Hello.
Joe.
Thank you, Diane, for taking my call. I love
Sure.
it when
Thank
Mr. Alda, for whatever you're doing in this area. I'm looking for some advice. I'm kind of an amateur scientist. I'm a geriatric physician, and I go to China every year for about a month with Sichuan University in Chengdu, and so I have to give lectures on dementia, delirium, end of life, things that are coming up there in China. So my question is, they always give me a translator because my Chinese isn't very good. And so how do I reach out to the audience? How do you know your audience if you're working through a translator?
That's
What
so
a
good.
great
You know, you remind me,
question.
on my first trip to China, I met with some actors and I wanted to improvise with them, but I couldn't speak Chinese very well either, and they couldn't speak English. So we improvised entirely in gibberish. So I don't recommend that for your lecture. But gibberish was a common language that we had, and that's one of the improvising games. But I think, you know, I have talked with Chinese audiences too, and they're just like us, regardless of what language you're speaking in. Before they pay attention to the actual words you're saying, they're getting cues from your face and your tone of voice. And are you really connecting with them? It's not enough. And I can't tell from what you said if this is what happens, but it wouldn't be enough to say the words to the translator so that the words are then coming from the translator. Your persona, the extent to which you can convey your own enthusiasm for what you're saying, is going to mean a lot to their understanding the words that they finally hear from the translator, I think.
That's a great point. You know, the other thing I have found in speaking to large audiences is never to use a podium.
Me too. I'm so glad to hear that.
Really?
I think people bury themselves behind the fortress of a podium.
Exactly. I never use notes.
Yep.
So I'm walking around the
Perfect.
stage
Yeah.
and I'm talking, trying to communicate what I know.
And you're not it sounds like you're not speaking totally from memory. You haven't memorized something. So which is sometimes
Absolutely
the
not.
same as reading to them.
Exactly.
And the reading voice is so different from the spontaneous
spoken.
voice. There's a rhythm that almost everybody gets into, and there's almost a melody that they get into when they're reading. And I sometimes, when people read, sometimes on the radio or on television, when they get to the part where they start reading, I can't understand them because they're not doing it in the same natural bursts that spontaneous speech comes out in.
And, the first time I was visiting a station in Arizona, and there were hundreds of people there in this big hotel. And I'm waiting on the sidelines next to the manager of the station. And all of a sudden, I looked up at the platform and I said, "Where's the podium?" And he said, "You don't need one. Just go up there and talk."
Great. So that was your first experience.
Yeah,
and then you realized how great it was.
Trial by fire. And it was just so comfortable for me and for
one
the
of the
audience.
things it does is really put you in the lap of the audience. So you have a much more intimate connection than you do if you have this armor in front of you of the podium.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Here is an email from Michael Halpern with the Union of Concerned Scientists. He says, "We work with thousands of scientists to improve their ability to share their expertise. It's the young scientists who are most enthusiastic about stepping out from academia to engage. But how can we make this kind of public service something that scientists are rewarded for in their careers rather than just scientific publication?"
Yeah, that's a really good question, because not only are scientists sometimes not rewarded for being very good communicators with the public, sometimes when they get to be star communicators with the public, they're considered to be less good as scientists, sort of ipso facto. That's sometimes called the Carl Sagan effect, because he got turned down by inclusion in important scientific societies sometimes because they felt he wasn't that serious.
Isn't that
but the time has gone by now.
Yeah.
It's not as bad now.
Right.
I mean, I don't think anybody talks about, although I must say, I heard Stephen Hawking referred to by somebody as, he's not that good a scientist.
Oh my
and he's made real contributions to
my
science.
gosh.
But and this was years ago anyway, but there is sometimes this seesaw where if you're too heavy on public acceptance, you go up, and you're not so heavy on professional acceptance. But I think as it begins to be understood that it actually is a public service, and it's not only a public service benefiting the public, it benefits science.
Of course.
When you go to Washington, you talk to the policymakers and you want a grant, you're talking to fellow citizens who are tuned in to not your education, which you've spent 30 years acquiring. You're talking to people who have gotten their knowledge of science from the culture by and large. And if you don't infuse that culture with a deeper understanding and love and respect for science, you're not going to get the funding.
Are you giving up acting?
No. I was a movie I was in just came out called The Longest Ride, and I have a small part in a really interesting movie that Steven Spielberg directed that's coming out in October. It's about the U-2 incident
Called
Bridge of Spies. It's a very, very interesting movie. And I got the chance to work with Spielberg, which I've always wanted to
How
do.
marvelous.
He's a lovely guy.
So you're balancing your life.
I am. I mean, last year I did 2 movies, several television episodes, and a play on Broadway, and still spent 90% of my time trying to help scientists communicate better.
I love it.
One time, one weekend, I had to go, before I got on a plane to go to Chicago to make a speech to 3,000 hospital directors. I had to go to Brooklyn to have my head blown off on a television show. Then I got on the plane, gave the speech to the thousands of people, came back, and the next day opened on Broadway in a play. I mean, I don't know how I did that.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Alan Alda, who is truly a man for all seasons. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Loved having you
I
here.
always love it.
Come back and see us
Thank you.
again. Thank you all for listening. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Alexandra Boteed, Susan Casey, Danielle Knight, and Allison Brody. Our web producer is Erica R. Hendry. The engineer is Timothy